Hello, my name is Matthew Humphreys. We will be presenting Alice Munro's Walker Brothers Cowboy. The section that I will be going over is the biographical section, which will talk about her personal life as well as the awards that she's won. In addition, I will also be going over the works cited and explaining our different sources.
My name is Bethany Carter, and I will be presenting the history of the time period of which Walker Brothers Cowboy was written, which was during the Great Depression.
My name is Jalen Richter, and I will be presenting the major works done by Alice Munro.
This is Michael Huddleston. I'll be presenting Alice Munro's Walker Brothers Cowboys main summary.
I am Caden Lewis, and I will be presenting the additional information that adds fun facts about Alice Munro.
This is Matthew Humphreys. Biography. Munro was born to a poor family in Wingham, Ontario. Her birth name was Alice Ann Laidlaw, and she was born on July 10th, 1931. Her family struggled throughout her childhood, and you can see this reflected in some of her writing, as a lot of her stories, as well as Walker Brothers Cowboy, which this is about, are centered around families during the Great Depression. She began writing in her early teens, and she actually joined the University of Western Ontario in 1949, though she left 2 years later. The reason for this was because she had gotten a scholarship for 2 years for the University of Western Ontario, likely due to the fact that she was at the top of her class. But that money ran out, so she had to leave. She was a leading short story writer of her generation, and she is still alive. And she won the Man Booker International Prize in 2009, among other awards, including a Nobel Prize in 2013. Her stories are written in a way that hint at her own history. What I mean by this is what I mentioned just a moment ago. Her family struggled, and the economy was poor, so that is reflected within her writing. Bio continued. Again, in 2013, she was awarded with the Nobel Prize for Literature by the Swedish Academy, calling her a master of the contemporary short story. She was raised on a collapsing enterprise of a fox and mink farm, as she put it. It was just beyond the most disreputable part of town. In 1951, at the age of 20, she married her first husband, James Munro. This is what her name comes from. She then moved twice, first to Vancouver, then to Victoria in 1963. It was in Victoria where they started a bookstore and raised their 3 daughters. She moved back to Ontario when her marriage ended in 1972. This is where she lived with her second husband.
This is Jalen Richter doing Alice Munro's major works. Alice Munro composed many short stories. Her first collection of short stories was The Dance of the Happy Shades, published in 1968. This collection of short stories won her the 1968 Governor General's Award for English Fiction. Next, Lives of Girls and a Woman, 1972. This is a story about a girl who grows from a young lady into womanhood. Something I've Been Meaning to Tell You, 1974. This was a gothic drama. The Moons of Jupiter, 1982. This is about a middle-aged woman who has to go through her dying father's last moments. Friend of My Youth, 1990. This is described as an allegorical commentary where a narrator reminisces on the events of her life. The Love of a Good Woman, 1998. Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage, 2001. Runaway, 2004. The View from Castle Rock, 2006. Carried Away, 2006. And lastly, Too Much Happiness, 2009. All of these were short stories, but many of these were the stories that earned her awards.
This is Bethany, presenting the history of the time when Walker Brothers Cowboy was written. The story takes place in the 1930s. It was also during the Great Depression. At the peak of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was so low that it actually hit 25%. The Great Depression affected many people in many different ways, and there were different reactions to this dark time. Some of these reactions included train hopping, moving to California in hopes of job opportunities arriving, or living in rundown towns. These rundown towns were nicknamed Hoovervilles. This era caused a plentiful amount of political reform, most of which enacted by Roosevelt and his New Deal. In addition, there were no shortage of people talking of Marxism and the possible benefits to it. This is Bethany presenting more history. Ironically, the American people were drawn even closer to democracy and the common man. This common man was the center of many different things. These things included Roosevelt's speeches, Frank Capra's movies, and paintings by Norman Rockwell. The writing of the time was largely in retrospect to the difficulties of the Great Depression and living in such a time. As well as this, there were a few authors who focused on private affairs of the individual and their experiences. Munro is shown to be both of these sorts of authors, at least within Walker Brothers Cowboy.
Michael Huddleston reading the summary. The Walker Brothers Cowboy is told from the viewpoint of a woman who is recounting memories from her childhood surrounding her father. It takes place in Canada during the Great Depression. It begins describing the state of people during the Depression and what her family and neighbors were going through, filtered through the understanding of the child. Her mother was making clothes using old ones, because new ones could not be afforded. The family used to have a fox farm that had failed, and the father took work as a door-to-door salesman. Most of the story's events come from the events that happened to the girl's father that day. They don't get to spend much time together, but the father took that day as a chance to do so. The narrator recounts her father telling her about the Great Lakes and how they were formed. Next, the narrator gives account to the door-to-door selling process the father must have gone through daily. But not ordinarily, they stop at the house of an old flame of their father's. Summary, Part 2. It is during the visit that the girl gets a new insight to her father's life, and possibly a double life that he leads. The lady puts on a nice dress, and they drink, even though it was thought that her father did not drink. The end of the story is characterized by the narrator going through the events and information through her head and trying to make sense of it. This whole experience is implied to be somewhat jarring, as if it was difficult for the girl to think of her father being with anyone other than her mother. The conclusion that comes from this is that her perception of her father has changed, and she sees the difference between the world of child and adult, and that lets her mature a little bit more.
This is Caden Lewis presenting additional information over the story Walker Brothers Cowboy. This information will better allow the reader of the story to understand how and why it was so well written. Alice Munro was born during the time period of the story, which was the 1930s, so she was able to understand the effects of the Great Depression on families at a personal level. This enabled her to write not only about the economic effects, but also the impact that it had on the individuals and their families, which she experienced as she grew up. In addition to this, she also added personal experiences to the story from the perspective of a young girl as how she would have experienced them. When writing, she stood strong through the rejection and criticism from multiple publishers, as well as the restrictions that were imposed onto her as a wife and a mother of 3. She was a loving wife and focused on her family over her work for many years. These restrictions kept her from devoting much time to writing a novel, which was the reason that she was so focused on short stories, of which there are many to choose from. In her 87 years of writing, she had accumulated 22 literary prizes, which included a Nobel Prize for such excellent work over the years. This is Caden Lewis on the second slide of additional information about Alice Munro. One fun fact about her home is that it was eventually turned into a beauty parlor after she had moved out. Now, continuing on with more interesting facts that help understand the story and who she is. At her present home, those that live near and around her do not actually know who she is and that she is a famous writer, because reading and writing is not super popular there. Alice likes to claim that she enjoys this as it makes her feel free from her work. Growing up, unlike many writers who were encouraged to read and write all the time by family, reading was not encouraged in her household. When her mother found out that Munro loved to read and write, she insulted her by comparing her to a relative who was considered a shut-in. As Alice grew up, she decided to continue her education into college. But she was forced to drop out as her family did not have enough money to continue paying for tuition. She claims that if she had continued college, she may have been discouraged to become a writer as it did not have the best chances of making good wages. Her biggest regret in her life was her decision to not stay home and take care of her aging mother.
This is our works cited. Our first source is the story itself from our Norton Anthology of English Literature. This is where we got all of our information for the summary and so forth. Our second source is a biography of Alice Munro from Encyclopedia Britannica. This is where we got most of the information for the biography. The rest of the information for Alice Munro and her biography came from our last source, from Thacker Robert, the Nobel Prize in Literature 2013. This mostly had information regarding her works and awards that she had gotten, particularly the Nobel Prize. This last source was over the Great Depression, and this is how we got a large chunk of the information for the Great Depression and the effects on it, on the people, and on the economy.